So thanks for coming out. If you're here for how user experience addresses unconscious bias. And I'm Marcus Finley, so I'll talk to you through our session today. Before we get into it, you probably have heard seen this slide 100 times already, but you should be making buy decisions today based upon existing Salesforce products. So I'm Marcus Finley. When I like to do my bio, I like to use emojis. How many of you out there are emoji users like me? So it looks like we have a couple. So for me, I'm from the sunny state of Florida. Hopefully our thoughts are with those in Florida right now as they're experiencing the hurricane. I love all things digital, and that's kind of been my driving force around my experience and the foundation of founding our digital strategy company, developing innovative products around AI, bots, mobile, and web experiences. I love football. I'm a Florida State fan, and I have a young son, which I'm crazy about, and he loves balls. He throw balls around the house all day long. And I love creating user experiences, and that's been our focus and what we really love to do every single day at our jobs. So what we want to discuss today, so we'll be talking about unconscious bias. So it's going to be a little uncomfortable, but we're in a safe space, so let's not pretend that people back there are listening to what we're talking about. But it's a really relevant and pertinent conversation that we should be having about how unconscious bias affects user experiences and how we as developers can make sure that we're designing and making sure that we're creating inclusive designs and experiences for people interacting with our software. And then we'll also want to talk about our role on our project teams, if you're user experience designers or developers, and how we all can play our part in ensuring that we have an inclusive design. So before we get into it, let's define what unconscious bias is. So for those who may not be as familiar with the topic, unconscious bias is the mechanism that our brains have to kind of help us to make decisions quickly, to be able to understand how to group or categorize things or situations to make sure that, one, we stay safe, but not besides making safe decisions, but also how that we can quickly be able to determine how we should interact with people, things, or things that we encounter in the world. So unconscious bias isn't a bad thing as a whole, but we have to be very thoughtful on how those biases are affecting our interactions with people or situations we interact with. So let's just be clear that all of us have unconscious bias in some form, but we need to be more thoughtful in how it affects us. So let's talk a little bit more about this. So as we're thinking about user experience and the development of software, the work that we're doing here at Dreamforce, these things start to show themselves in our work as you're thinking about inputs or the experiences that you're presenting back to users. So we like to share this example here where as you're thinking about the things that we do every single day, you ask about gender or questions on forums. And in this particular example, there was an attempt to be able to be more inclusive around gender, but it was a little bit off as you get down to the option for those who want to select something outside male or female, and it says it's complicated. So those who may not identify with it being it's complicated may have been turned off by that presentation. So being more thoughtful about what we're presenting, how we present it, and how we allow others to interact with the software we're developing becomes more and more important. And we have to be more clear about the assumptions that are driving the decisions in our development process. Another thing as we're thinking about unconscious design is thinking about we all have blind spots when it comes to our own personal bias. And so we're able to see it in others obviously really easily as we kind of look around and we're interacting with people. We obviously see their own biases, but we don't see ours as easily, and that's been shown through all of this cognitive science work. So we want to do a really quick exercise here. You don't have to share your own findings or your own experiences, but I want to pull up an iPhone. So what I want you to do, maybe you just jot it on a piece of paper there by yourself, but I want to help you kind of explore how your own biases kind of play into how you may categorize people based upon either the way they interact with technology, their age, their sex, gender, all those things. and how we use the things that we see around us to make those types of decisions. So if you take a quick second, jot these down, look at this iPhone, look at some of the apps that you see on this particular iPhone, identify what could be the potential gender of this person, what is their job, do they understand technology, are they knowledgeable about technology, could they be a dev, could they be an admin, or would this be a person you want to hang out with? So take a quick second, take a look at the iPhone and really kind of think about how you make decisions about who this person may be based upon some of the things you see on their phone. So for those who've started playing around with this idea, how many think this particular person could be female? Any just kind of quick show of hands. So a couple think female, how many think male? So I see a couple more that think male. Was it ESPN app that maybe, for those, was it the ESPN app that kind of drove that idea? And so that's where we're kind of talking about unconscious bias. It could have been the female. Females could like ESPN apps. I know my wife does. So thinking about how we look at things that drive our decision making, how they may play into our biases of who may like what or what type of experience this person may want based upon our assumptions of who they are. So now that we've uncovered that, we have now unlocked our own unconscious bias. And so let's talk about how we move from unconscious bias into implicit bias. So implicit bias is moving from this place where you're just unconsciously moving through the world and not thinking about how your own personal biases affect your interactions, not just through the design of software, but with human interactions. And so the idea is that you're actually very thoughtful about in your own personal work that, we're designing experience for a certain demographic. I may not fully understand that experience. And these are my biases around this group just because I'm unfamiliar with it. And so let me do certain activities or things that help me broaden my perspective to be able to address those biases that I may have to be more implicit as you're working with that particular demographic. So one thing that's really useful, Harvard University's team has developed an implicit bias test. So I really recommend, as you're trying to explore this and be more aware of what your own personal biases are, to be able to take this test and be able to help you start that process to really understand what these effects or what the biases that you may have be affecting either your work or your interactions with others in the workplace. So I think that's probably the first step to make sure that you're really acting in place of implicit bias. So now that we're thinking about, we've covered unconscious bias, we've talked about implicit bias, how does this affect our work as developers and user experience designers, as we're working with our Salesforce clients or building applications on top of the work that we do, is becoming more and more, as we're thinking about user-centered design, to be very thoughtful about that we're not using our own assumptions to drive the decisions that we're making in our experiences. And that was really the driving point of this quote. So let's talk about a few examples of where implicit bias or unconscious bias can affect the work that we're doing. And let's talk about a couple steps that we can do to make sure that we can be better at our work, to make sure it's more inclusive. So how it shows up in user experience. A lot of times this is when they really start showing its head in the way that we're starting to get input back from users. And this is one example. We like to bring this up a lot because it kind of brings it home. As you're thinking about just the first name field that we present in pretty much every application that we do, there's so many ways that we can get it wrong based upon the groups or the demographics we could be building for. There could be a limitation in the number of characters, and so those who have really long names or names from other countries may not be able to fit within maybe a 15 character limit for a first or last name field. Or those who have names that have two parts could be affected by having field or validations in a field that says you can't have two-part first names. So really thinking about the users you're targeting and how maybe even the simplest things as first name fields could be able to turn them away from the software you're developing for them. And that's really where we believe unconscious bias starts showing itself through the user experience process. The other thing too is we're hearing more about Einstein and more of us are starting to develop AI bots. It's starting to become more and more important that as we're developing these bots, we're thinking about how how we're developing could be generating an experience for the end consumer around bias. This is one example we heard of Tay when they first launched it by Microsoft, and people, messing around with machine learning. But there's a good lesson learned to make sure that as we're developing these bots, we're thinking about the conversations that we're developing for them, making sure that we're thinking about the context of gender or who's going to be on the other end of these conversations driven by the bots. So it's going to be increasingly more important to think about how bias may be caught up in this experience that we're developing for our AI bots. So implicit bias. So one thing that we're working on was a conversational bot similar to what we saw there with Tay, but in an educational experience. And so what was really important was to think about, one of the first steps where you want to be more inclusive in design is really expanding the bucket of personas that will be addressed in the application itself. So in this particular application where people will be interacting with a bot from a historical perspective, there is a varying level of ages from, they could be the high school from 17 to 18, or they could be over the age of 30. So those different types of groups have different experiences with technology. Now thinking about gender, or if language isn't their first native language, how do you develop an experience that's different for someone who is a native English speaker versus one who isn't? And thinking about that as you're expanding and thinking about the different groups. And so that's where you start expanding the way your personas start driving the decisions that you make. So really expanding the opportunities for really digging in deeper with those user groups. Thinking more implicitly is also should be actively happening in the discovery phase. Really pushing your team to think about who you're targeting and go outside the box of the traditional just one or two users. But sometimes the edge users are the ones that could be the most dramatically affected by unconscious bias. So really, I know a lot of times we do like to focus in on one or two users, but let's span the bucket a little bit more to make sure that we're not missing those people on the edges. Think about, as you're thinking about your teams and you're looking at different cultural groups that you may be addressing, as a team, do we fully understand these cultural differences? Are there weaknesses in our team that we don't fully understand this group? And what can we do more, either through testing, user interviews, to be able to get a better understanding of the group that we may not be very well suited to be developing a design for? And then the biggest thing is just talking about it, being able to have an open conversation from a user experience or a developer about not fully being able to, or if you're not feeling very comfortable about the group that you're trying to develop an experience for. On the development process side of it, it's, we mentioned it before, it may show up in the validation side of the work that we're doing. So being more thoughtful about the things that we do every single day around validating fields or the work that we do, and making sure that, one, do we need to validate around gender? Do we even need a gender question? Or all those types of things that we kind of just take for granted, be more thoughtful about the things that we're validating against as developers. And it's going to be even more heavily needed to be able to do more user testing if you're addressing groups that you may not be as culturally in tune with, or groups that are user personas that you may not be as more connected to. So wanted to show this slide because as you're thinking about how you address implicit bias, one thing that you think of when you think about your own tech team is you think about your team from the TV show of looking like this, but now as we're even looking around this auditorium, this floor, we know that our development teams don't look like this anymore. They're expanding to be more like this. And that's the ideal that you want for your team, is to be a more inclusive team. That, one, it makes it much easier for you as you're trying to address different cultural groups and trying to be able to have an experience that's more inclusive, to have a more rich and diverse team that makes it a lot easier to make sure that you're not missing some of these red flags around the experience that you're developing. So really pushing your team to be more diverse will be a huge driving force in really making sure that you have a more inclusive design and development process. So I want to leave you a couple more tips around making sure that you're designing implicitly. As you're thinking and going through the user experience process, it may be easy to think about just this one persona. And it may be useful to just flip the script on that particular user and maybe go to the flip side of it. So if you're thinking males, 35 and over, flip it, think female, 18 to 25. Does our experience vary for that particular group? Is there something unique that we're not thinking about? we're not saying change the experience just for gender, but are there things that we're missing or we're actually excluding based upon the experience? One example we like to bring up is a lot of health, tracking apps have been coming out, and some of them completely miss the ability for women to track cycles. And that just kind of shows that maybe on that team they weren't as inclusive in their thought around the ability to be able to track for different genders. So that's where we want to make sure that as you're developing this work, that you're also going to expanding the base and really thinking outside the box around the groups that you're targeting. Question yourself, as you're actually developing this work, you're going to have to consistently kind of remind yourself and thinking implicitly. So it would be great to take that test, really know where some of your weaknesses are so that, one, you can kind of reshake yourself and kind of jolt yourself and make sure that, hey, am I thinking from a place of unconscious bias or implicit bias? We talked a little bit about acknowledging and addressing diversity on your team. That's going to be hugely important. But also hold your team accountable. If you see there's weaknesses and inclusion in the designs that you're making, feel like hopefully talk to your leadership about how we can address some of these weaknesses in our designs. If we see there's weaknesses or we see that there's other groups doing better and being more inclusive, figure out how you can incorporate that into the work that you're doing, even as simple as input forms, but really expanding and thinking more about your applications as a whole. So I really want to put it on you to be able to really push your team and be more accountable in the presentations and the development work that we're doing. And the big part is kind of work from the power of empathy. If you're always thinking about your customers, which we all should be doing, let's also think about them from a personal level and think about how their personal experience with the software that we're developing could be impacting them. And that's going to hugely make sure that we address some of these inclusion issues that we're seeing and the experiences and hardware that we're developing. So some design steps here. Let's make sure that we're developing for diverse user groups by removing bias. Also be very aware and create open discussions and try to actually create a discussion and maybe take this discussion back to your development team to get a better understanding of how your team wants to be able to address some of these issues and the work that you're doing. So I will leave us a little more time for Q&A, but as we're thinking about developing and designing more implicitly, let's remove ourselves from the design process and use more empathy, be more intentional, and use this empathy to really drive the experience that we're trying to develop as developers, user experience designers, and also think about the humans on the end of the software that we're developing for. So I really thank you for your time, and let's try to address any questions that may be out there.
So I have a question about your example.
All right.
I work for an organization that has questions, deals with questions of gender identity, control of personal identity, and so forth and so on. If that example is not necessarily the most skillful one, what is better?
Can you repeat the last part of it? I missed the last.
If the example you gave is not the most skillful way of doing it, have you addressed that, and what do you think is a better way of doing it?
So you're referring to the gender?
Self-identification of gender.
Yeah, so there's a couple ways that you can approach it. I mean, one, you can just confirm, do you actually need to know gender of your users? Is there an experience, does it really benefit your experience to actually know if they're male or female? And so that's probably the first question you should make. And then two, there's a lot of work being done around pronouns and how that could be a useful mechanism for addressing the male-female question. There's a lot of examples. I could share that through Twitter. There's a lot of great resources about using pronouns versus just using male or female. So that's one way to kind of address the gender question as you're thinking about inputs. I think I saw another person. Any other questions? If not, our team's constantly working on this topic. We're definitely going to be developing toolkits to help teams get better at addressing unconscious bias. So if you just feel free to hit me up on Twitter, Marcus A. Finley, and we'll definitely keep you up to date on toolkits and things that we're doing to help make this process a lot better. Thank you.